Hey everybody, it's Joy Forrest with Call to Peace Ministries, and today I'm really excited to have my friend Julie Owens on here with me. Julie is an expert when it comes to domestic abuse. When I think about domestic violence expert, she is the first person that comes to mind. I think that's your website title even. So
Thank you. Well, we all have our forms of expertise.
that's right. Today, I really wanted to interview you about trauma and overcoming trauma because obviously you experienced some pretty severe trauma. And then I noticed on, I guess, a Facebook post you had a while back about how you overcame your own trauma. And could you just tell me in a nutshell, because I had not heard of that before. I know that the way I was healed was kind of a different way too, but go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we all just use the tools that are presented to us, and I really didn't know about trauma. I this the woman, the PhD, who had done marriage counseling with us once or twice a week, which was extremely ill-advised because it just kept us in the tension all the time, and it was escalating. She realized after I learned it was domestic violence, I taught her that it was, and together she showed me. I remember picking up the diagnostic statistical manual and turning to the page with PTSD and saying, I think this is what's going on with you. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, here, nightmares, flashbacks, exaggerated startle response. I mean, this is me. I'll wake up in the middle of the night in a sweat after having had a nightmare. And I will accidentally, back into a piece of furniture and scream or something like that, and I was always constantly, scanning and looking for the abuser, even though he was in prison and all of that. So, the learning that it was that, and that it was normal and expected, and that I wasn't crazy was huge. And I think the support group was absolutely necessary.
So as you're talking, I know that you discovered you had PTSD, and I didn't know what it was, but I had it. And now, I working with the women in the support group, I mean, the overwhelming majority, I think about 80 to 90% of them, it seems, I know that the statistic is at least 80% of women, and it doesn't even have to have been physical or as dramatic as your story is.
Yeah. Everybody's reaction to trauma is different, of course. And one of the things I learned by then studying PTSD, because what happened is I was approached by a psychologist who was a specialist in trauma. I lived in Hawaii. He was a professor at the University of Hawaii, and he invited me to come and speak to his master's class about PTSD and tell my story. And all of his research up to that point had only been about combat veterans. And when I told my story and I said, I believe that women and children are the biggest group of PTSD sufferers in the world because of domestic violence and child abuse and child sexual abuse, and yet nobody's researching this, everybody's just focusing on combat and so forth. He got really intrigued and he invited me to do some research with him. So, we had started, my church, we had started a transitional shelter for battered women where we paid for them to go to therapy and everything, and a ministry at the church, and also an interfaith ministry for the community. And we were doing all kinds of stuff to try to help. But, I knew that PTSD was something that, no matter how many support groups you go to, no matter how many times people lay hands on you and pray for you, if you've got PTSD, you need some very specific intervention. And so what I taught him about domestic violence, he taught me about PTSD until they started calling me a CD-ROM of PTSD. Nobody knows what a CD-ROM is anymore, but I was just like, soaking it all up and going to. I was trained by some of the best in the world because the research that this psychologist was doing was at the National Center for PTSD, which is part of the VA. And he hired me to be the project director on 2 of his research projects. They were both 3 years long. And I recruited, all the victims and survivors who wanted to participate and get free therapy. And it was extremely intense therapy that took place for about a month. but these 2-hour sessions, and I was trained by him and another advocate, one of my actually mentors and best friends who had worked for the prosecutor's office as a victim witness counselor for years. We were trained to do the same therapy, even though we weren't clinicians, because a big reason for this therapy was to find out if you had to be a clinician to do this. Because basically, as you know, people heal in lots of ways. And most of PTSD, you know, a big part of it is just the education about what it is and what to expect and why things are happening, and, you know, how you're, you know, it's not your fault and it's normal, and here's what you can do.
And I think too, we attach lies to what's happened to us. You know, we start believing lies about why we went through what we went through. Sometimes we believe the lies about ourselves.
We've been brainwashed, right?
Yeah,
You know, how many times I learned that it takes 21 days to brainwash somebody, and how many days had I, you know, heard these same things over and over from my abuser.
Yeah.
And if somebody's got cumulative trauma, it's like, you know, layers of an onion, right? Somebody who was abused as a child, and then maybe date rape and other things. I mean, it's just, the trauma is so big. I mean, it almost has to just be peeled away until you get down and to the last big thing, and you're able to work through each of these. And the focus of this particular therapy was on dismantling trauma-related guilt. You don't hear people talking about that a lot, but that was the heart and soul of the therapy. And it was a very specific, manualized process for helping a person remember only what they had known then when they did whatever they did that they felt guilty about. And a lot of times it has to do with, I should have left. I never should have married him in the first place. I shouldn't have exposed my children to this, and so forth and so on. So we developed a lot of instruments, including trauma history assessment instruments and so forth and so on, and then, so that everybody got pre-tested and post-tested, and to see how their PTSD changed. And they all had full-blown PTSD when they started, and most of them had no PTSD at the end of it. So cognitive behavioral therapy was kind of the way to go then, along with EMDR. This is in the 90s. And EMDR, you know, eye movement desensitization retraining is another thing that changes the brain. Well, we learned that the brain changes because of trauma, because of the stress hormones, the catecholamines, you know, the adrenaline, everything that floods the brain. And, you know, when a trauma is happening, it's why we, you know, fight or freeze.
You know, basically all of that ends up rewiring the brain.
Yes.
And so I'm going to put in my biblical counselor points, because, you know, I am a biblical counselor.
Yes.
I'm
so glad.
Yeah. And so the cool thing to me is that when research actually, to me, supports what scripture tells us already. Jesus said, you'll know the truth will set you free.
Yep.
I mean, to behavioral therapy, we got to take every thought captive, you know, to the obedience of Christ.
Yep.
So I think I told you too, that my own PTSD was healed, but it was through reciting scripture to myself and singing it and reminding God and just praying it over and over again. Well, it's very interesting. I had seen this brain scan of somebody who was just reading and studying, and it says nowhere in scripture that we should study scripture. It says we should meditate on scripture. And I know that's what I was doing. I mean, I was like soaking myself in it. And over time, I mean, those same symptoms, I had the same symptoms as you, that, you know, the nightmares, the jumping and way overreacting to things that shouldn't have
Yeah.
like that. And it went away. I mean, you know, and it probably wasn't as quickly as 2 weeks, but it did go away, you know.
That's another thing about the trauma, is that, you know, it can't be post if it's still happening.
Exactly.
So, you know, somebody could be in a relationship and it's acute. I mean, they can have traumatic stress happening, but if it's after the event, it's post. And sometimes the symptoms don't show up until years later, and they get worse years later. Yeah. And it's really interesting that you don't necessarily have to have the symptoms right away, that they show up, and that's when you really kind of feel crazy. Trauma-related guilt and trauma-related angers are reactions to the trauma. So the first thing that happens is, you know, the event or series of events happens, and your brain is flooded with all of these stress hormones that then change the structure of your brain. uh, we, that's what we were learning then. And we were starting to learn that there are certain things that can change your brain back or again, you know, and it's not that you become the person you were, you become, like Oprah says, a new you, and your brain can heal. And that's the beauty of it. But one of the things that realized was that when someone felt guilty, or we say thought guilty, because it's guilt, trauma-related guilt is a bad feeling plus the belief that I should have done something differently. And that is such a roadblock to healing, because you keep beating up on yourself all the time. So developing instruments to find out what the survivors felt guilty about and thought guilty about was really key, so that we could work specifically on them. And we saw ourselves as coaches. They did their own healing. We just were guides. You know, we weren't doing anything to them. We were just, it was like being a teacher. You know, here are some things that you could try, and go do this and do this homework, and then, you know, come back and let's talk about it. And before they did any of the therapy, they learned progressive muscle relaxation, which is relaxing every muscle head to toe. And it was very meditative, and listening to a tape. So learning to get control of the anxiety some of that had to happen before the therapy could even begin, because just going into therapy is very anxiety producing, right? Because victims tend to, a lot of people tend to catastrophize and to exaggerate the danger that's out there, and to begin to think that all men are dangerous and so forth and so on. A huge part of the therapy, was what we called avoidance busting. Mm-hmm. So we created a questionnaire to learn all the things that they didn't do anymore that they used to do. And they didn't do them anymore because it was too upsetting. It brought up memories, whether it was music or foods or sounds or places or certain clothing or whatever that would freak out the survivor. What it did is it took away a lot of her agency and power in her life. You know, trauma, what it does is it takes control from us. When something like that happens, we're helpless. We lose control of our lives. And being able to get that back means everything as far as the healing goes, taking back our reality and taking back control of our lives. And so that's why I think it's really important for victims and survivors to be able to do their own therapy work, and having these workbooks and things is powerful.
Yeah. So you were part of that. It was called what? Healing the Trauma of Domestic Violence, I think was the name. That was the book that.
Well, that's the workbook that came out of it. And that's the one my name isn't on, because.
Oh, well, I know. That's what I mean. I know you
were. But it is based on everything that we did, and it came out of that.
I actually wrote a blog post called "How Can I Forgive Myself?" And you commented on it, telling me that about the guilt and the regret that we live with. And usually it's not guilt. It's not even things that we should feel guilty about, that we had no control over. And, you know, and I wrote that from a standpoint of, we're also failing to recognize that God can even use our mistakes. And that's what, when we're believers, then God can redeem even the mistakes that we've made.
Right.
Thank God for that.
And sometimes the things that we think are mistakes weren't even mistakes. They were just reactions. We were like a twig in a hurricane. We didn't have control. And so a big part of this working on the guilt was to help people remember only what they knew back then, you know, and that's talking someone through, you know, when did you learn it was domestic violence? When did you realize it was affecting your kids? When did you, so forth and so on? Because what we tend to do is use what's called hindsight bias. It's like Monday morning quarterbacking. Once we learn the truth, we look back and go, I should have known better. I shouldn't have done that. And sometimes that's when PTSD develops or gets worse. So PTSD is so much about how we think.
Oh yeah. Well, we beat ourselves up, and of course, our abuser has played into that because they do brainwash us, and they tell us that everything's our fault, so we take it. And
Right.
what I meant is like mistake. My mistake was even marrying him in the first place. You know what I'm saying? So we
Yeah,
get,
and that's what most women say.
yeah,
What should you, what do you think you should have done? I shouldn't have married. Well, okay, so then what you do is you go back and you look at, what did you know then? Did you know he was going to be an abuser? And you actually break it down into what you knew then versus what you know now, and go through a process until the person is able to say, yeah, I didn't know then what I know now. And at the time, here's what I thought would happen if I didn't and do this thing, and here's what I thought would happen if I left him. Here, and when they look back, or we look back, have a very healthy appraisal of the situation, we realize that we did the best we could. That given the actual choices we had, we didn't have an option to just walk away safely. But given what we actually had, we probably made what's the least objectionable choice given the options. And so guilt is not just hindsight bias and looking back and beating up on ourselves. It has to do with a sense of responsibility. And when we would ask victims, how responsible were you for what happened? Say the kids getting screwed up, for example, they would a lot of times say 100%. And what we would do is go through an exercise where they actually list everything they could think of outside of themselves that played into making this domestic violence occur. And we'd say, aside from you, what are all the other things? Okay, he was raised in a violent home. He gave himself permission to do these things. My mother said, "You made your bed, now lie in it," and wouldn't let me come home. And all not to assign blame to people, but to assign a percentage of how responsible you think they were for this. So a lot of times, almost always, it would add up to over 1,000% outside of themselves. And we would say, now, wait a minute, you say you're 100% responsible for making this, for what happened, but what about, where am I going to put all of this, uh, so to analyze all of these other factors and to look at all of the things that she's been avoiding, certain kinds of cologne, men with uniforms, that song, that restaurant, that part of town. All of this is part of healing ourselves. But what it means is, in order to do it, it's like there's this huge obstacle in our path on the way to healing, and we have to have the courage to face it and blast it out of our way. And what we tend to do is, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. And if we do that, the PTSD is not going to get better. Usually, it's not going to go away. We have to actually retrain our brains to think of it differently. And there's a lot of ways to do it. There's a lot of different kinds of therapy now. I mean, the one I'm talking about is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy where you have distorted thinking about something that's happening, and you learn new ways of thinking about it. And part of our homework that everybody had every day was, whenever they would say negative things about themselves in their head, they had to write them down. And really watching and listening to your brain, what you're doing and what you're saying, because it tends to embed, entrench PTSD, the negative thinking. So that's a big part of it too.
You know what I always tell people? It's like, I heard a Bible teacher talking about frisking your thoughts according to Philippians 4:7.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Is that thought true? Well, number one, like if you've lived with abuse, 9 out of 10 times what you're thinking is not even true. Especially in most of the survivors that I know who deal with a lot of PTSD and panic attacks and everything else, they really are hard on themselves. Like I could see what you're talking about. They do take the blame. They are.
I think, one of the things that has occurred to me is, I think one of the reasons we blame ourselves is it makes us feel like we have some sort of control. It's this false illusion that if I had done something differently, maybe it wouldn't happen. But the truth is, we couldn't have stopped the abuse. We couldn't have changed our abuser. We were not in control. And acknowledging that is really important. But and it's scary though. It's scary to think that there are things that we don't have control over, but we don't. And when we're traumatically bonded to someone, and I think that's another big piece of this, we see the world through their eyes. So we've been with this person who was controlling most aspects of our life and brainwashing us at the same time and abusing us, so that we became so bonded to them in a way that despite the fact that they're the one that threatens us, they're the one we feel most familiar with. And so losing them in a way means losing ourselves. And so we trade our escape skills for coping skills. But when we look back, we don't see that. We just see, I stayed because I was stupid. We don't understand that about traumatic bonding. We don't understand about dissociation, for example, or when someone kind of goes into a trance state. And when people have been abused as children, they're more likely to be what we call dissociative, or just sort of check out, see themselves from outside of their body, even to some degree. And when that's happening, and that is, an extreme part of some people's PTSD, we have to be able to learn grounding techniques and ways to kind of stay in the room. Because if we tend to leave our bodies and sort of drift off and go into this sort of trance-like state, we're even more vulnerable than ever because we can't defend ourselves. And, I worked with one young woman, for example, who had been sexually abused as a child. And then she, and really bad, witnessed her mother's domestic violence at the same time. And then she became a victim of domestic violence. And, I still know her. She's a wonderful Christian. I've known her since she was a teenager. And what would continue to happen was that she would continue to get raped over and over, and she would blame herself. But she would dissociate when a man would make a move on her. She would totally freeze. She couldn't fight him off if she wanted. She couldn't say no if she wanted because she left her body.
Yeah. I heard that research that people who have severe trauma, childhood sexual abuse victims who dissociate are way more likely to be raped. And,
it makes us more vulnerable. So one of the things about healing trauma is that it takes a lot of courage. And that's why I think group support and even group therapy is really important, because you support each other when you're feeling especially vulnerable and weak and defeated. And your sisters in recovery are, maybe their day is not going as badly, and they're going to hold you up, and you'll do the same for them. And we reflect each other's beauty and goodness and worthiness back to each other. When we're just alone and going to a psychiatrist and talking about the trauma all the time, that doesn't necessarily make anything better.
Yeah.
But everybody has a different way of healing. For me, my PTSD was literally cured within a week when I took a model mugging self-defense course, and it's full force fighting a padded attacker, which was absolutely the most terrifying thing I ever did, but in the end, the most empowering thing, because I learned how to deliver a knockout blow within 5 seconds of being attacked. And I was trained, overtrained, until my body just reacted. It knew what to do. And I felt like if I ever get ambushed again, in the dark, like I did before, when I couldn't have pulled a gun if I'd had one. There's no way I could have defended myself. My body had to be my defender. And if I had frozen, if I hadn't dealt with my trauma, on a cognitive level, if I had just frozen, I would be a sitting duck. And if I didn't have any way to defend myself physically, I would as well. And so I heard about this, and my dreams changed during this week-long period. It was a 24-hour class, and every night, I used to dream I was in the prison, locked with him. My abuser went to prison, or he was charged with attempted murder and convicted of attempted manslaughter. And he was in prison, and I would get attacked in the prison, and the prison guards would just be standing there and not moving or trying to help me, and I would wake up in a sweat. And every night that week when I was doing this, my dreams changed, because I became more convinced that this was going to help me, and that I started to take control of my body back, and trusting my body to protect me, to be there for me. And it was in a very therapeutic environment. And as I was slowly trained to do these particular moves, if I was attacked from the front or the back or from a sleeping position, it empowered me. And by the end of the week, the last PTSD dream I had, I was locked in the prison with him, and I knocked him out, and that was it. And that was the beginning of 1990.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that we were talking about that. It sounds kind of like exposure therapy. You just keep doing
yes.
what you're afraid of. And I like that idea. I think because it's just like anything, even in therapy, if you're covering something up, if you're hiding it, you don't want to talk about it, it just gives it more power in your life. And so in order to take the power from it, you kind of have to face it. You have to bring it out into the world. And so that's what you did in a very physical way. And I like, that's awesome.
Yeah. And and I was like, I can't trust my body. I've never done any sports. I'm not an athlete. I'm fat, and I'm old, and, all of these things. But there was old women, there was young women, there was all kinds of women in this course. And of course, men can take the course, teenagers can take the course, and it's expensive. And I was fortunate that my marriage counselor, who felt terrible that she had done counseling with us, helped me get it paid for through criminal, victim compensation funds, which was pretty unique.
That's awesome. So let's say the women that are watching this now don't have that kind of money to do that kind of thing. Let's do things that they can do that would be helpful to help them overcome. I would say the reason the meditation really did work for me, because it's reaching the whole brain. As we know, trauma gets stuck in parts of the brain that are just not reached by our logic.
Right.
So for me, meditating on that music was powerful to me. And so that's why we believe that the EMDR is effective. And most of the women that I work with who do that say it is very effective. Because it's tapping into different parts of the brain. It's helping the parts of the brain communicate with one another. So you can tell that traumatized part of your brain, hey, you really are safe now, because they know that. The traumatized part doesn't know the truth.
That's right. And, people who have these reactions, PTSD symptoms, often feel guilty or weak, or like there's something wrong with me. But the fact is that we need to be able, our bodies have, the human body has developed the ability to fight, freeze, or fly, run, or whatever in a trauma, and your body knows what's safest for you. In my case, I froze. I was paralyzed with fear. And, and then I look back and go, why didn't I just pick up a lamp and hit him over the head, and stuff like that. But what your body does, we need the ability to do that, because it can be our friend. Perhaps if I had fought him, I would be dead right now, because he had a knife, of course. And so we don't need to hate that. We need to embrace that, but we need to move beyond that. And there are many different ways to do it. And I think of healing as like, there's this giant toolbox out there, and you can try, meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR. And nowadays, a lot of the therapies are around integration of the right and left sides of the brain and the higher and lower brain, because we've learned that PTSD is a physical thing. It's a biological response. It lives in the brain, and it lives in certain parts of the brain. And it even explains why people, a lot of us, we can't remember so much of the trauma. especially in the very worst episodes, we forget. For example, I don't remember being stabbed. I had to almost do a timeline in my head to figure out when he stabbed me. And I figured out it was when I was trying to hold him back to keep him from, leaving me and attacking my father. And I'm okay now with not remembering that because my body knows that I don't need to remember it. But what's so great is, to understand that the reason I don't remember is because something was going on in that area called the hippocampus, and there's research that shows the hippocampus, the area that holds traumatic memory, which is totally different than normal memory. It's smaller sometimes. It's actually gotten smaller in survivors of child sexual abuse, for example. So that's why they don't remember. So learning about PTSD is a gift to ourselves because it helps us normalize our symptoms and realize that it's not something's wrong with me. And that's what, of course, trauma-informed care is. It's not about what's wrong with me. It's about what happened to me. Yeah. And we're trying to move now away from trauma-informed care even and asking, to what's called healing-centered engagement, which is really about where culture and the community is all central to it. We're just not a lone person. The reason we're traumatized and the influences on us and our trauma and our recovery is much bigger than ourselves. So there's a such thing as insidious trauma, for example, which, it's like it's inherited almost. And we know now from the work on what's called epigenetics in the brain that trauma can actually be inherited. So, for instance, the children of Holocaust survivors, African Americans who are descendants of slaves, enslaved people, trauma, because it changes the brain, then that person's genes are different when they conceive a child, and that child's brain is based on the parent's brain, right? Makes sense. So now some of the therapies don't even require even talking about the trauma anymore. For example, trauma-informed yoga has been shown in studies to be more effective than any medication ever used. Isn't that interesting? And yoga reintegrates, the right and left sides of the brain. When we do yoga, we are in control of our body. Our body does the things we tell it to do. And so that's why it's so important to go to somebody who, if you're seeking therapy or healing, to make sure it's somebody who is an expert in trauma and who understands intimate partner abuse.
We had a woman in our group and she had to go where her insurance sent her for a trauma therapy, and she went in and the trauma therapist says, well, Christian trauma therapist says, well, I can't just talk to you. I need to get your husband's side of the story. Sent her into a panic attack. And I thought, are you kidding me? So that is definitely somebody who doesn't understand intimate partner violence. And
they need to have expertise in both trauma and domestic violence, because one without the other is going to be dangerous.
Yeah.
But, I want survivors to have hope. I want them to know that if they are living with trauma symptoms, they don't have to live with them forever. It can be addressed and you can be healed. You don't have to live like this forever, but it might take a lot of courage and some, doing things differently than you've done before. Because what happens, the longer we live with the anxiety, and PTSD is an anxiety concern, diagnosis actually, it becomes really embedded, and and we tend to exaggerate. It gets worse. It gets entrenched. So that's why this avoidance busting thing I talked about is absolutely critical. One of the classic examples is the woman who is raped in an elevator. And so she avoids elevators because they're so anxiety producing. It reminds her of the rape. So she takes the stairs instead. Well, in reality, stairs are more dangerous than an elevator. Elevators aren't dangerous at all. So these non-dangerous reminders, like elevators, have great power over us. And our lives begin to be arranged around them and avoiding them. And we take our power back when we start to face them and realize that they can't hurt us, that they're just reminders. So abusers are dangerous, but if he was a police officer or military member, a uniform isn't. And if we panic when we see a uniform like he wore, that's not helpful. We don't need to be paralyzed. I mean, we can't defend ourselves if we are. We need to overcome that. If we used to enjoy a certain food or a glass of wine or whatever, and yet the smell of those or the memory of those is upsetting because it was something he did or he used, then the more we expose ourselves, you mentioned exposure therapy, the more we expose ourselves to it, the less power it has over us. Mm-hmm. So it's like treating this kind of anxiety or addressing the kind of anxiety is a lot like you would a phobia.
Yes.
Say if I'm afraid of cockroaches, I hate them. In Hawaii, like giant, we call them 747s, and they were everywhere. No dormant season, right? And just an example would be you start, and it's called exposure therapy. You start like with a rubber roach across the room, and when you can finally approach it and maybe touch it, then you go on to a dead one in a jar. And then when you no longer freak out over that, then you may be a live one in a jar, and so forth and so on. So a little bit at a time, what happens is you become less and less freaked out the more you expose yourself. And that's the idea of exposure therapy. Well, we can't expose ourselves to our abusers, obviously.
Right. Whatever our triggers are, we can expose ourselves to those triggers very slowly and surely, and take it easy.
Just being aware is critical, because being aware of what's dangerous and what isn't. I had one client who came for therapy, did therapy with me, who had been pregnant, and at this particular absolutely stunningly beautiful beach, and her abuser, she was in the water and he was shooting at her in the water and she was dodging bullets. Well, she never went back to that beach again, even though he wasn't there. So she literally was depriving herself of this favorite place because it was so anxiety producing to think about being there. But when she was in therapy and she started to go there, just, for little brief periods, eventually she took it back and she was able to do that, and it no longer had power over her. Yeah. And these kinds of things make a big difference. If our anxiety is lessening, our brain is changing. So, we're doing therapy with ourselves when we do this kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, because both you and I mean, you did do the class, but I'm telling you, I did not, there was nothing that I did. I didn't know about EMDR. I never went to even therapy, but the meditation for me was and I also I proclaimed a lot of scriptures over myself, and I told myself, I'm not going to be afraid of this. I mean, I would, if something was triggering to me, I would sort of talk myself down to some degree. And something that was interesting to me as I was coming out of it, I realized, how in scripture, God says, fear me. And it dawned on me one day, I'd been living in fear of this man for 23 years of my life. I met him when I was 15 and didn't get out till I was almost 40. And I thought, well, no wonder, because whatever we fear is what controls us.
Yes.
So you were talking about that control thing earlier, and how we think we're in control, and we do try to control it as victims, not in a mean way. We are trying, if I could just do this, this, and this, then it won't happen. And we feel out of control. So, finally putting God on the throne for me was huge. I mean, it really relieved me of my fears, and my fears were well, PTSD and fear are just synonymous, in the anxiety, obviously.
Right. Right. And, and what happens is a lot of times when we start to see the world as a very dangerous and dark place, and certainly it can be. But if we go the route of starting to believe that all men are dangerous and not trusting ourselves to even say date again or be in a love again, I mean that's certainly a personal choice. But to limit our human expression of love because of fear is a really sad thing, and yet we don't realize what we're doing is every time we do some of these things that we do to avoid the anxiety, we're actually like giving a booster shot to our PTSD. I had one client who she was being stalked, and that makes it really hard, obviously. And so she would drive around the block whenever she would get home from work to check to see if his car was there or anything. And she would do that, but she still felt anxious, so she would drive around again. And eventually she was just driving around and around and around the block. And it didn't make her any safer. The first time was fine. It was enough. But and every time, this is how it works. Every time you do the thing that gives you relief from the anxiety, whether it's avoid the elevator or drive around the block again, you're actually feeding the PTSD.
Yeah.
And learning that, and having somebody to walk through that with is absolutely critical for survivors to do. Because while you can develop trauma-related, your PTSD can be entrenched because of that trauma-related guilt that I was talking about. Another way it can go, when we're trying to figure out the meaning of why did this happen, and we're asking all those questions, and if we answer it, it's because of something I did. That's trauma-related guilt. If we answer the question in our minds, it's because of something somebody else did, men did. Yeah. Okay, that's trauma-related anger. Some people actually go that route. And sometimes I think men tend to go that route more. And, whereas trauma-related guilt leads to, depression and low self-esteem and a sense of hopelessness, trauma-related guilt leads to, social isolation and maybe hostility and bitterness and really being in a very stuck, dark place.
Yeah.
Because we go, why did this happen to me? And we answer it not because I did something I should have done. It's because he did something I shouldn't have done. Yeah. And certainly abusers do. But I think this also ties into the idea of forgiveness, which, we know is not saying what you did is okay, but saying, I'm not going to live in bitterness. I'm not going to let it change me and make, I'm not going to let it take away my joy.
Yes.
And that was a big lesson for me. I wasn't externalizing and going, I was afraid. My thing, and I think a lot is fear. I wasn't so angry at him. I mean, I knew he was a very damaged person because of his childhood and so forth and so on. But I also had that pity for him, which is a gigantic trap, as we know.
Oh, yes.
But I also didn't feel guilt for what I did. So, my PTSD, it really wasn't in either of those places. I'm not trying to say that it has to be, you only have PTSD if you blame yourself or blame others. It's not that. I mean, guilt is one piece of many people's PTSD. And what we found out is that when we can eliminate that thinking, change that distorted thinking, and live in the truth, the truth sets you free. It really does set you free, not just spiritually, but physically and emotionally. And we get our power back. And, if we say, I got beat up because of something I did, because, I should, the way I talk to him, and I blah, 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 blah. Again, false sense of control. We couldn't make somebody abuse us, and we couldn't stop them from abusing us. And we have to acknowledge that. All we can do is respond. If we live in resentment, it will poison us. And I love what the writer Malachi McCourt said. He said, resentment is like taking poison and waiting for someone else to die.
I was wondering who that quote was from. I've been using it for years. Thank you.
Malachi McCourt, he wrote a great book called Tis, and he's the brother of Frank McCourt, who wrote Angela's Ashes. They grew up in Ireland, very poor and abused. And, I would say that survivors like you and others that I admire who, are such overcomers and are conquerors, we're more than conquerors.
Yes.
It's because they have faced their fears and they have let go. Yeah. They have let go of the need to change the past, something that they can't do anyway. Yes. And they've also learned to let go of the need for an apology or an explanation or the answer to why did this happen.
I always tell people to go down that why trail. It's so much better to ask what. Like, what do you want me to learn from this, God? Or what are you trying to teach me? Or how can you use this?
That's good.
Much better questions. So
I like that. I mean, asking questions is good, but we're never going to get the answer to why it happened. Why does domestic violence happen? Because somebody chooses to abuse us, because they have a sense of entitlement and they believe they have a right to control us and to keep us in line or whatever, because of their dysfunctional, twisted, distorted belief system. A lot of times, based on bad interpretation of scripture or misinterpretation of scripture. But it's the whole issue of letting go, I've learned, is a process, not an event. We should never expect anybody to do it or mandate that they forgive. It's very personal. And it takes time. Yes. But if you know that it's just literally letting go, kicking him off the committee in your head, taking your power back, instead of focusing on him all the time, which is is such a waste of time. Focusing on ourselves, it frees us.
Oh God, yes.
That prison of focusing on the abuser. I mean, he's already taken enough from us. He already controlled us long enough. Let's not let him control us anymore. But it is a process, and everybody's process is different, and it depends on not just how they were traumatized, but on other things in their life as well, other traumas, other oppressions that they've experienced, who they are, how they're treated. So for me, a white woman who was raised in a comfortable, nonviolent family, I had this big trauma, a lot of psychological trauma, which we know, is as bad or worse than physical a lot. Yes. But I think, my healing came more quickly because I didn't have all that damage from childhood, and I hadn't been brainwashed by pastors and people who were telling me it was my fault and my job to change him, and I could, and so forth and so on. I had less to undo in a way. I was fortunate that way. But for somebody, say, who's a minority or, has been abused in other ways or discriminated against in their life, or who has been poor or otherwise disenfranchised or marginalized, their process is going to be different. I only know my perspective. They're going to, so I think we ask ourselves and we ask the Holy Spirit, what is it that I need to heal? Show me what I need to heal. And the truth is that God has imbued many people with many talents and ideas and therapies. And there's this gigantic world of a toolbox out there. And all we have to do is try this and this and this and this until we figure out what feels right for us and works for us. I did a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And this helped with that, and that helped with this. There's no one way to heal.
Yeah.
And we need to be good to ourselves and not put ourselves on a timeline.
Or put it in a box. It's like I always tell people they put God in a box, but we also put our healing. And I heard, I was listening to something the other day, and the therapist was saying, healing is not a linear process. It's not sequential. It's not going to happen because there may be, and I tell people, God's healed me. And then, and the big thing for me, huge part of my healing was being healed from fear. And it was really perfect love that cast out my fear. But the interesting thing is, I thought, I've conquered fear. And I'm telling the ladies in the group, and of course, don't you know, God gave me a lesson to show me 22 years after getting out. It's a different kind of fear. So,
yes. And healing is a lifelong process. And we need to not be impatient with ourselves but it's like this, you say it's not linear. Well, indeed, it is not linear. We have good days and bad days. We have days when we're not triggered and days when we are triggered. And that's just how it goes. We need to just accept that. Learning what to do when we're triggered is what's important. So, in order to continue on our trajectory of healing and becoming who God intends us to be, there are all these life lessons. How are we going to deal with this abuser if we have children with him, for example, and we're going to have to communicate some way? What are some tips and things, about how to do that without being re-traumatized every time? How do you do that? How do you deal with people who want to assign blame to you for why it happened? All of these things that are, they're always going to come. I mean, I've been healing for 30 years, and I'm still learning things that I need to work on, that I'm doing or thinking that isn't healthy, that isn't the best me, And so being vulnerable and open to continuing to learn and to change and grow is really key. And it just courage, but you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really, really appreciate your time. And if you
enjoyed it very much, Joy.
Yeah, same here.
I always love talking to you. I learned from you too.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you very much. I failed to mention that you are on the advisory board for Call to Peace. So when I really need to know something, Julie's my go-to person.
It's what Joy is doing with Call to Peace is very unique and special. And that's why I did agree to be on the advisory board, because there are lots of ministries out there working on domestic violence, but not all of them are like Called to Peace. And we have to discern, which ones are really the ones that are really doing the work in a way that the right way, I guess,
Thank you. Yeah.
I've seen a lot over the years, So.
Well, I think a lot of people have a lot of zeal. In fact, in my workbook,
yes,
things that I have found is that a lot of times I don't think that people are healed enough to do. I mean, like you dove into it and you talk about how you were angry and you were more of an activist. And see, God did not allow me to start this ministry for 20 years. I had been out for 20 years before we basically started the ministry. And so I'm in a different place. And
that's the beauty. We all have these different healing experiences and trajectories, and yet we all, we can come to kind of this very similar place by a different route.
Yeah. But I think too that if people don't heal, a lot of times they can become so activist oriented. They will start directing survivors instead of empowering them.
Yeah.
So telling them what to do, you've got to get out and this, and
Mm.
decisions for them. So I think that maybe the fact that we're, I've learned to be an advocate through a
Right.
lot of experience. I've been an advocate since probably 97. As soon as I got out, people started coming to me, and then I worked in the shelter, back in the early 2000s, but,
That's where I learned most of what I know is in shelters and working.
you had
I
to.
mean,
The church didn't know anything. I'm telling you, like when I started this, there was nobody in the church talking about this at all. And I was, I think, I had a couple of books, Nancy Nason Clark and
my good friend,
yeah,
yes.
I know there were a couple of books out there. So I won't say nobody, but you could get all the books, the Christian books on domestic violence. That was it, man. When I first.
And now there's so many. And
Yeah.
I just this week started writing an article about what to look for in a Christian resource and what are some things to look for and what are some things that, that are good signs and what are some things that maybe don't mean that this is a resource that's going to be real healthy for you, whether somebody's got a degree or, a bunch of followers doesn't necessarily mean that they are really well trained in this. I mean, in a way, we're fortunate because we were trained the hard way. We went to the school of hard knocks. We were victims, but a lot of people who are doing this work, they were never there. And so they don't see things through the eyes of a survivor. And I think it makes it really different, their approach.
Well, and I think, like you said, your therapist didn't get it. Most therapists don't get it. They don't get a lot of training. I've got a degree in biblical counseling, and back then I got very little on domestic abuse. And so I think that people's natural tendency is this, well, let's just call this therapist in, or let's call this counselor because they should know domestic abuse.
He's a Christian, she's a Christian and a therapist, but they don't have a clue about the kind of stuff we're talking about that is so critical. And what I learned about PTSD, I learned from someone who isn't a professing Christian, but that made me a better person to be able to help other women in the church who had been through what I had been through, and to be able to train pastors and Christian counselors. So the gifts, they just come from all different unexpected places.
That's it. Well, I had to learn from this, I learned from the shelter. I learned from reading on my own. I learned from a program that I went through that I wouldn't even recommend, but I saw a power and control wheel, and that's what finally opened my eyes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Because nobody had ever been able to put their finger on what was going on in our home. And when I
when you saw that, it was like a light bulb, right?
Well, I started crying, I thought, because I've been telling people, I stood before a judge and going to get a protective order, and I said, Your Honor, this has not been an abusive relationship, because he hadn't been punching me every day. That's when the word batterer.
Me too. I said I'm not a battered woman.
Yeah.
But my husband tried to kill me when I left.
So he might have strangled me at this point, and yet I was like, I'm not. This has not been an abusive relationship. And unless somebody's been through that, they don't understand the mind games that go into that, where I saw him as the victim instead of me being the victim,
I did too. And I not long ago, I was moving and I was going through files and stuff, and I came across the police report about our attack and ambush and stabbing. And down at the bottom, I had written, I don't think he meant to do this. I felt like it was really important to say that for some reason. But, that's probably another topic too. But, that traumatic bonding thing, why we so over-identify with our abusers, and we try to protect them, and we make decisions based on what we think is in their best interest instead of what's based on our best interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I sure did it for years, and then finally seeing the power and control wheel, and whoever was facilitating said, so you really think that he can't help himself? Because this is like when we have support groups, everybody comes in with excuses. He wouldn't do it if he weren't drinking. He wouldn't do it if he weren't bipolar. He wouldn't do it if it wasn't
Right.
all of these things. And, you know, so I was doing the same kind of thing. But when this guy said, so you really think he's out of control? I thought he was snapping and lost his mind, you know, because he looked crazy when he would go off.
Me too.
And he said, so if he's really out of control, just let me ask you something. When he's breaking things around the house, whose stuff does he break? His and yours, or just yours?
Right.
Well, mine. He said, well, that says to me that he's got some element of control, you know. And so having somebody ask me those questions to help me realize, and he doesn't do this at work, does he?
Right.
So,
And, you know, and just like a lot of times when victims, you know, think it's because he's drinking or drugs, you know, I'll ask them, does he get drunk or high with other people? Yes. Does he beat them up? No. You know, so this kind of thing is really, really important, because I don't think of it so much as excuses, but explanations. I mean, how do we make sense of this? Why somebody who says they love you would do these things? And because they usually didn't do them before we got married or lived together or whatever, and then all of a sudden it starts, naturally we would think, oh, he's sick, something's happened, I need to help him, married in sickness and in health. You know, and then we start down that road of trying to get him help.
yep.
Believing that he's sick, rather than, you know, he's making a choice because he thinks he's entitled and superior and has the right. It's so important to be able to analyze that, you know, and just like the anger thing too. I mean, they don't always abuse when they're angry, right? You might be sound asleep in bed when they jerk you up and interrogate you, or at a party, you know, when everybody's having a great time and, you know, he thinks you looked at a man, you know. It's important, I think, to really unpack all of this stuff, because, you know, Satan's a liar, and we've heard so many lies from our abusers that we've got to confront them, challenge them, and eliminate them from our thinking.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, that's it. That's the perfect entry for our ending. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to turn off.
Thanks, Joy.
I really appreciate it.